The deeper the mind, the lonelier it tends to become. This line could be read as a curse, but also as a revelation. It carries the discomfort of an unsettling truth. The most intelligent, sensitive, or lucid people seem inevitably drawn away from social life. Not because they don't need it, after all, every human being is born dependent on bonds, but because sooner or later they realize that daily interaction comes at a heavy cost. The cost of superficiality, of masks, of the endless theater of appearances. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher of pessimism, saw this reality with brutal clarity. For him, intelligence was paradoxically a source of solitude. Those who think beyond the average, who feel with greater intensity, who notice the details hidden behind the curtains of habit, inevitably drift away from the crowd. Schopenhauer didn't say this as praise, but as a plain observation. To him, life in society often reduces itself to a spectacle of banalities, where conversations orbit the fleeting, the trivial, the distractions that keep us from confronting the ache of existence. And the clearer a mind becomes, the less tolerance it has for such games. Think of the eagle. While the herd stays together, grazing in harmony, the eagle rises alone into the sky. From above, it sees further, captures the entire horizon, tastes the freedom of the wind. But that same altitude separates it. The herd cannot understand the solitary flight, and the eagle cannot find rest among those bound to the ground. That is the paradox. Intelligence grants a panoramic vision of existence, but the price of that vision is distance from everyone else. This experience is not only philosophical but visceral. Who hasn't felt out of place in the middle of a group conversation? Surrounded by people, yet utterly alone in thought? The body present, but the mind distant, yearning for something deeper than rehearsed laughter or small talk about the weather. For many, this is only a fleeting experience. For some, it is the constant rule. And in that case, the retreat from social life ceases to be a choice and becomes almost inevitable. In his work, Schopenhauer pointed out that human beings come together not out of affinity, but often out of necessity. We need each other to survive, to bear the weight of existence. But that need does not guarantee depth. On the contrary, most of the time we live surrounded by shallow, utilitarian relationships, shaped more by habit than by authenticity. And it is precisely here that the sharper mind feels the shock. For if there is one thing a deep gaze cannot tolerate, it is artificiality. Yet it's important to understand that this withdrawal does not mean contempt for humanity. Schopenhauer did not despise humankind as a whole, but he saw in it a structural inability to sustain authentic and profound connections. The philosopher believed that genius, true lucidity, isolated the individual because it made prolonged coexistence with banality impossible. It was as if ordinary people spoke a language made of light and casual words, while deeper minds carried within them a heavier tongue, harder to translate. Dialogue between these worlds is possible but exhausting, and over time, it wears one down. In the modern world, this paradox only deepens. Social media has turned human interaction into a permanent spectacle. What once took place around the dinner table or among friends has now become the timeline, an endless stream of quick opinions, instant judgments, and interactions as easy to create as they are to discard. For those who seek meaning, silence, or depth, this environment is suffocating. The intelligent individual, who already felt out of place at parties and gatherings, now finds the same superficiality replicated on a global scale. It is as if the noise has multiplied, making it even harder to find spaces of authenticity. But there is an even deeper question. Is isolation truly a symptom of failure, as many believe? Or is it, in fact, a sign of depth? In a culture that worships extroversion, constant socialization, and public visibility, solitude is almost seen as a sickness. The one who prefers silence is branded as odd, antisocial, or troubled. And yet, if we look back, we see that some of humanity's greatest thinkers, writers, and artists lived much of their lives in seclusion. Not because they hated others, but because they needed emptiness around them for something greater to bloom within. The solitude of the intelligent, then, is not absence but consequence. Not an escape but a destiny. It is the inevitable reflection of someone who has seen through the absurdity of the social game and can no longer play it with the same lightness. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, another solitary thinker, once said that the crowd is untruth. Schopenhauer would likely not have disagreed. Both saw in social life a danger, the risk of losing oneself in the attempt to belong. But this realization is not easy to accept. After all, the human being carries within an unshakable need for belonging. To feel part of something, to be understood, to share one's pain. When intelligence or sensitivity pushes us away, what remains is the paradox. The ache of being alone and the impossibility of ever being fully with others. This is the starting point of our journey. The paradox of intelligence and solitude is not just an abstract idea. It is alive in modern life, in hollow gatherings, in virtual connections, in the struggle to find depth amid so much noise. And if Schopenhauer was right, perhaps the question is not how do we avoid solitude, but rather, how do we inhabit it without being consumed? To be intelligent does not necessarily mean to be happy. This is one of philosophy's most uncomfortable truths, and Schopenhauer understood it with almost brutal intensity. For him, to think too much was to suffer too much. To see the world with clarity is also to see the suffering that runs through it, the fragility that sustains it, and the absurdity that saturates it. The lucid mind is like a lighthouse in the night. It not only illuminates the path ahead but also exposes the surrounding abysses. Those who live in the twilight see little, and therefore stumble less upon hidden horrors. But those who see farther are denied the privilege of ignorance. And lucidity, though precious, is heavy to bear. Schopenhauer believed that life, in its essence, is marked by suffering. Desire is never fully satisfied, and when it is, it soon gives way to boredom. According to him, we are condemned to oscillate between the pain of longing and the emptiness of fulfillment. At times we yearn for what we lack, at others we grow weary of what we have already attained. In this endless cycle, heightened awareness is not a relief but an amplifier. The intelligent person does not merely endure the cycle, they perceive it, analyze it, understand it. And that very understanding torments them even more. In contemporary psychology we find echoes of this vision. Highly sensitive people often report feeling the weight of things in an intensified way. A piece of music can bring them to tears, a social injustice can ignite profound outrage, the smallest rejection can unleash disproportionate pain. What for many is just background noise, for the sensitive becomes a storm. This is not weakness but the very openness of mind and heart. And inevitably, those who feel this way seek refuge. They seek distance from the flood of stimuli that modern society relentlessly pours upon them. Think of the banality of social conversations. For most, talking about the weather, about gossip, about the latest viral meme is harmless, perhaps even pleasant. But for the more lucid mind, this surface feels unbearable. Not out of arrogance but because with every passing second comes the sensation of wasting something precious. Time, life, psychic energy. While some delight in the lightness of the trivial, others feel that this very lightness is a weight in itself, the burden of not going deep enough. That is why so many of the most intelligent and sensitive withdraw. They don't turn away from social life merely because it feels shallow, but because it hurts. Banality for them is not just boring, it is suffocating. Every minute spent in a conversation that does not touch the soul is felt as an irreversible loss. At this point, solitude begins to seem less like a prison and more like a relief. Schopenhauer once said that clarity of consciousness is a curse. Not because it lacks value but because it forces one to carry the weight of truths most people would rather ignore. More than a century later, the philosopher Albert Camus would call this weight the absurdity of existence. The realization that we endlessly seek meaning in a universe that offers no final answer. The ordinary mind finds comfort in distractions, in traditions, in dogmas. But the lucid mind sees the crack beneath every certainty, the emptiness beneath every explanation. But is this pain inevitable? Or can it be transformed? Viktor Frankl, survivor of concentration camps and founder of logotherapy, offered a different response from Schopenhauer. For him, the pain of lucidity became unbearable only when it lacked purpose. To see too much can wound, but it can also open the possibility of discovering deeper meanings. The problem is that this search demands crossing the desert of solitude, and few are willing to make that journey. In modern life, this pain of lucidity multiplies. Never have we been so informed, so connected, so exposed to collective suffering. Every scroll of the screen confronts us with wars, tragedies, inequalities, disasters. The entire world, compressed into a device, pours its anguish upon us. For many, this excess breeds numbness. We pass indifferently through the suffering of others as if changing channels. But for the most lucid, this flood of pain is unbearable. And once again the consequence is withdrawal. Turning off the phone, avoiding the news, reducing contact with the world. Lucidity hurts, and isolation seems to be the only anesthetic. Yet this anesthesia comes at a price. For the more we withdraw from the noise, the closer we come to ourselves. And what we find within is not always easy to bear. Solitude can offer relief, but it also summons our own ghosts. Here lies the dilemma: endure the pain of lucidity within social life, or endure the pain of silence within solitude. Neither option is simple, but both reveal the paradoxical condition of those who think and feel more deeply. Perhaps this is why so many geniuses of the past oscillated between creative greatness and existential suffering. Nietzsche, for instance, experienced moments of philosophical euphoria, but also sank into crises of isolation and illness. Kierkegaard wrote about faith and the individual, yet lived most of his life in radical solitude. Lucidity nourished them, but it also consumed them. It was as much a source of creation as of torment. And here we return to Schopenhauer's paradox. For him, lucidity did not free one from suffering, it merely made suffering more visible. And by making it visible, it drove the individual away from others, as if in need of protection from a world incapable of grasping their pain. Lucidity was not only a gift of intelligence but also its curse. The question that remains is, what about us? What do we do with this pain? If we perceive more, if we feel more, how do we transform this weight into something bearable? Some find refuge in art, others in spirituality, still others in small circles of authentic friendship. But the challenge never disappears completely. Because, at its core, lucidity will always carry a cost, and sooner or later that cost is solitude. Had Schopenhauer lived in our time, he might have found confirmation of his ideas at every corner, on every phone screen, at every party filled with rehearsed smiles. To him, social life was nothing more than a grand disguise, a collective theater meant to hide the unbearable emptiness of existence. We converse, we distract ourselves, we seek company not for depth, but to numb the void. And the clearer a mind becomes, the more it perceives this futility. Schopenhauer saw society as a stage where few dare to be authentic. Most people wear masks, repeating gestures and phrases not born from within but from the need for acceptance. The result is a coexistence saturated with superficiality, where the essential is sacrificed for the sake of convenience. People, he said, do not want the truth, they want distraction. And perhaps there is no more accurate definition of what we now call social life. In the 21st century, Zygmunt Bauman called this liquid modernity. Fragile bonds, disposable relationships, connections as quick as they are fleeting. In his analysis, contemporary life has become a marketplace of instant experiences. Friendships are forged with a click and dissolve just as easily. Bonds that should serve as refuge become little more than showcases of performance. And for those who seek depth, this environment offers no fertile ground, only quicksand. In practice, this means that many social interactions amount to empty exchanges. Endless conversations about consumption, status, or the banalities of everyday life. Social rituals that, for most, act as a lubricant for coexistence, but for the sensitive or intelligent feel like a waste of time. What may seem enjoyable to many, a night at a bar, a party drowned in loud music, a casual gathering to discuss trivialities, feels suffocating to the introspective. Not because they lack the ability to socialize, but because something more essential is missing: authenticity. In psychology, this phenomenon is often linked to the social exhaustion of introverts. For them, human contact is not a source of energy but of depletion. Each encounter requires mental effort to sustain the social theater. Every unspoken word, every maintained mask, is felt as a drain on vitality. And in the end, the cost is always greater than the reward. That is why many choose isolation not as an escape, but as preservation. But why does this discomfort intensify so much in more intelligent people? Perhaps because the lucid mind perceives what lies behind the spectacle. It cannot pretend not to notice the vanity hidden in gestures, the competition disguised as casual conversation, the loneliness concealed in shared smiles. Where many see only amusement, the lucid mind sees a collective ritual to anesthetize the absurdity of life. And this perception is both unsettling and liberating. A simple example: at a social gathering, one group talks about the latest hit series, another about the latest celebrity gossip. For most, this is enjoyable. For the sharper mind, it rings as noise. It cannot escape the silent question: is that all? Is this really all we have to offer each other? What is pastime for some is proof of the unbearable superficiality of social life for others. This feeling is not arrogance, it is exhaustion. The intelligent do not despise people. They are worn down by the futility of interactions. It is as if they are constantly searching for something that rarely appears, a spark of authenticity. And when they do not find it, they retreat into silence. Yet there is a cruel paradox. By withdrawing from superficiality, the individual also sacrifices closeness. For most human bonds are born precisely in the realm of the trivial. It is by talking about the weather, sports, or daily routines that we create our first connections. Those who reject this initial terrain often find themselves without a starting point for deeper relationships. Thus, the pursuit of authenticity can lead not only to isolation but to a practical inability to connect. Schopenhauer himself saw no easy solution. He acknowledged that social life is inevitable to a degree, but he viewed it more as a burden than a pleasure. His philosophy carried this skepticism. The closer we get, the more we hurt. The more we try to distract ourselves, the more we perceive the emptiness lurking behind distraction. Social interaction, for him, is a fragile antidote against the despair of existence. Yet this realization does not mean that social life is entirely useless. It can offer moments of relief, companionship, and even fleeting happiness. But for the most lucid, this happiness is always fragile, like thin glass on the verge of breaking. It is a joy that cannot endure because it rests upon the denial of what matters most: depth. And here arises an uncomfortable question. If social life is so futile, why do we cling to it? Perhaps because the alternative, total solitude, is even more painful. We need each other even if we deceive ourselves. We prefer the theater of interaction to the ache of absolute emptiness. But in doing so, we condemn the most lucid to a dilemma: participate in a spectacle they cannot bear, or endure the silence that few understand. This dilemma is increasingly relevant. In a world of constant exposure, where social performance extends to digital networks, where every gesture is recorded and evaluated, futility is not the exception. It is the rule. For those seeking meaning, the only seeming escape is to disconnect, withdraw, cultivate the inner space. But if we reject social life, what remains in the silence? This is the next step of our reflection: to understand whether solitude, so feared and avoided, can become not a void but a refuge. Up to this point, we have spoken of solitude as consequence, the almost inevitable withdrawal that intelligence and sensitivity seem to provoke. But there is another side to this same phenomenon, less painful, more fertile. Solitude is not merely absence. It can also be space. Not just isolation but refuge. Not just silence but a source of creation. Arthur Schopenhauer saw isolation not merely as a curse, but as a necessary condition for intellectual life. He argued that superior minds cannot endure the constant noise of social life because they require a quiet environment in which to flourish. Like a seed that only germinates in protected soil, creativity demands retreat. And while it is true that solitude can hurt, it is equally true that it provides the mind with a rare terrain, where deeper thoughts can take root. Nietzsche, another philosopher who spent long periods in seclusion, reinforced this idea. For him, those who seek to create something new must distance themselves from the masses. The crowd, with its noise and certainties, suffocates the boldness of thought. Only in solitude can one hear one's own voice with clarity. Only in solitude can one gestate what does not fit the expectations of society. Kierkegaard, meanwhile, maintained that truth can only be found within the individual, and that the individual can only become true by separating from the chorus. This conception is not merely philosophical but psychological as well. Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, spoke of the process of individuation, the path by which a person becomes who they truly are, integrating shadows, complexes, and potentials. This process does not occur in the crowd. It requires inner immersion, confrontation with the unconscious, and dialogue with symbols and archetypes that can only emerge in silence. Solitude, then, is not merely the absence of company, it is the laboratory of the soul. In modern life, this aspect of solitude is often forgotten. We live surrounded by stimuli, tasks, obligations. Silence has become almost a luxury. When we are not working, we are on social media. When we are not on social media, we seek out series, music, videos. The idea of simply being alone without distractions seems unbearable. And yet, it is precisely here that we lose something essential: the chance to hear the inner voices that only speak in silence. For the intelligent and sensitive who withdraw from social life, solitude can be transformed into a creative sanctuary. Rather than merely carrying the weight of isolation, they can turn this space into fertile ground. Reading, writing, music, art, contemplation. All these practices flourish more readily when we are not subjected to social noise. Many of humanity's greatest works were born from this kind of retreat. Books that changed eras, paintings that opened new perspectives, scientific discoveries that reshaped the world. But it is important to make a distinction. There is sterile solitude and creative solitude. Sterile solitude occurs when an individual closes off without purpose, sinking into resentment or escape. It is the kind of solitude that suffocates, that consumes, that turns silence into emptiness. Creative solitude, on the other hand, is active, fertile. It is the space where the mind withdraws not to flee but to gestate, not to deny life but to recreate it. And perhaps this is the true invitation behind the vision of Schopenhauer and other solitary thinkers. It is not about glorifying withdrawal as an ideal, but about recognizing that within it lies a potential rarely offered by social life. In solitude, we have the chance to write our own dialogues, to build our own symbols, to create an inner world that does not depend on the approval of others. In modern psychology, many studies link time spent in chosen solitude, not forced isolation, to higher levels of creativity, emotional clarity, and even resilience. When we are alone by choice, we make space to process experiences, reorganize thoughts, and strengthen our identity. Solitude becomes a mirror in which we see not only who we are, but who we might become. But there is a crucial point. Transforming solitude into refuge requires courage. Because when we close the door to the outside world, we open the door to the inner world. And we are not always prepared to face what we will find there. The mind can be a hostile territory filled with doubts, fears, and contradictions. That is why many prefer constant noise. It distracts. Silence, in contrast, reveals. In this sense, creative solitude becomes not just a refuge but a discipline. It is the practice of inhabiting oneself without fleeing, of sitting in silence and allowing the most uncomfortable thoughts to surface so they can be processed, of listening to emptiness not as an enemy but as raw material. As the poet Rainer Maria Rilke said, "Solitude is like the rain. It rises from the sea to meet the clouds and falls again upon us in long silent nights." In practice, transforming isolation into a creative refuge can mean small choices: turning off the phone, keeping a journal, dedicating hours to study or art, allowing oneself moments of undistracted contemplation. These simple gestures may seem trivial, but they are revolutionary in a culture that idolizes constant connection. It is in this protected space that the mind finds the oxygen to create, reflect, and breathe. And here arises a provocative question. When we withdraw from the social world, are we truly fleeing others, or are we drawing closer to ourselves? Perhaps the true function of solitude is not to sever ties, but to weave a more intimate bond with what we carry inside. Perhaps the isolation of the intelligent is not merely a tragic fate, but also a rare opportunity for inner construction. Yet this refuge comes at a cost. And it is this cost we will explore in the next chapter. The inevitable pain of withdrawal, the incomprehension of others, and the constant struggle between the need to belong and the need to preserve oneself. If solitude can be a refuge, it also exacts a price. There is no gift without a wound, no freedom without loss. And perhaps this is the central dilemma of the most intelligent and sensitive. To preserve their integrity, they must withdraw, yet withdrawal inevitably brings pain. Schopenhauer did not hide this darker side. To him, life in society was a burden, but solitude was also a weight. The wise man preferred to bear this weight rather than degrade himself in superficial company. He compared society to a fire. If we get too close, we are burned. If we step back, we feel cold. We are always in this uncomfortable in-between, trying to balance warmth and distance. The withdrawal of the intelligent is often misunderstood. To others, it may seem like arrogance, coldness, or misanthropy. Few realize that, in truth, it is often an act of self-preservation. The excess of stimuli, the mediocrity of banal conversations, the superficiality of relationships, all of this wears one down. The intelligent do not withdraw because they hate, but because they feel too much. And feeling too much requires retreat. Yet society does not forgive those who choose silence. We live in a culture that exalts extroversion, constant sociability, and public image. The individual who prefers solitude is seen as suspicious, incomplete, even unwell. People do not understand that, for some, being alone is as vital as breathing. Withdrawal then brings not only silence, but also misunderstanding, judgment, and emotional loneliness. Nietzsche spoke of this with both bitterness and pride. He said that the thinker must endure the pain of walking alone, because the herd will never comprehend his quest. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how, he wrote. But bearing does not mean suffering less. The price of difference is exclusion, and exclusion leaves scars. In modern psychology, this tension is widely studied. We know that humans are social animals with a deep need for belonging. Prolonged isolation can cause sadness, anxiety, even depression. That is why even the most intelligent and creative people struggle with withdrawal. The heart longs for companionship, even when the mind rejects the noise of the crowd. This is the paradox of solitude. We seek the peace it brings, yet suffer from the emptiness it imposes. This paradox becomes even more cruel in the contemporary world. Social media, which promise connection, often intensifies the sense of isolation. We see crowds of people interacting, smiling, living seemingly full lives, and we feel even further removed from that ideal of belonging. For the intelligent individual who already feels out of place, this contrast is brutal. It is as if society itself is rubbing in their face that they do not belong, do not participate, do not fit in. Here, withdrawal reveals its deepest cost: the loss of a place in the world. Human beings need mirrors, recognition, sharing. When we step too far back, we lose not only companionship, but also validation. We confront the risk of a dissolution of identity. Who am I, if there is no one to reflect my existence? And yet, even with all this pain, many choose or accept this path. For the cost of withdrawal, no matter how high, seems lower than the price of living drowned in superficiality. The sensitive mind prefers to endure solitude rather than sacrifice its depth. It is a bitter choice, but a coherent one. It is worth remembering that there are also those who attempt to strike a balance. To create selective bonds, cultivate a few authentic friendships, find small communities of affinity. This is perhaps the healthiest path. Neither total escape nor blind immersion, but the construction of an intimate circle that does not assault the sensitivity. Yet this is not always possible. Often, extreme intelligence, critical vision, and the relentless pursuit of truth make the individual even more isolated. As if always a few steps ahead of others, condemned to walk at a solitary pace. This cost is not limited to emotional pain. It also manifests in the body. Prolonged isolation can affect physical health, the immune system, and vital energy. Psyche and body are intertwined. When we lack human warmth, our organism feels it. That is why withdrawal should not be romanticized. It may be necessary, but it is also dangerous. A refuge that, in excess, becomes a prison. The great challenge, then, is to accept this cost without being consumed by it. To acknowledge the pain of solitude, yet also find ways to transform it into strength. To turn absence into a different kind of presence. As Simone Weil said, pure attention is prayer. Perhaps isolation is a form of extreme attention, a radical listening to one's own existence. And here arises the question that precedes our final chapter. If the cost of withdrawal is so high, how can one endure it without being destroyed? What is the key to transforming this inevitable solitude into something that does not merely consume us, but elevates us? This is what we will explore in the next and final chapter. How to reconcile intelligence with social life? Or at least how to find a way to live in solitude without being devoured from within. If Schopenhauer saw solitude as an inevitable mark of the most intelligent, perhaps the greater challenge is not to escape it, but to learn to inhabit it. Solitude, when not despair, can become wisdom. What once seemed empty can turn into fertile space. What was once absence can transform into presence of self. Here, philosophical and psychological insight converge. It is not merely about enduring isolation, but converting it into a source of growth. Jung said, solitude does not come from the fact that we have no people around us, but from our inability to communicate what is important to us. If this is true, then perhaps the deepest solitude is not an inevitable sentence, but an opportunity to develop an intimate relationship with one's own being. The wisdom of solitude begins when we stop seeing it merely as punishment. Of course, there is pain, and it would be naive to deny it. Yet within that pain lies a possibility, the chance to confront our own minds, our own ghosts, our own truths. When social noise falls silent, we hear what was once obscured, our fears, our desires, our paradoxes. It is a confrontation that demands courage, but one that can transform us. Nietzsche called this becoming who one is. He knew that this journey could not be undertaken amidst the crowd. To discover one's most authentic voice, at some point, the voices outside must be silenced. The solitary thinker does not withdraw merely because others cause suffering, but because he must hear himself. And only in deep silence is it possible to discern the sound of one's own heart. Viktor Frankl, a survivor of concentration camps, said that a person can endure anything if they find meaning. Perhaps solitude is precisely this, a call toward meaning. It forces us to ask, why am I here? What does my existence signify? What am I willing to endure in the name of my truth? By facing these questions, we cease to be mere victims of solitude and become its authors. In modern life, marked by incessant stimuli and shallow connections, this wisdom becomes even rarer and more urgent. We are surrounded by people yet distant from ourselves. We interact constantly yet rarely pause to reflect. In this context, voluntary solitude can be almost revolutionary, an act of resistance against the whirlwind of superficiality. But there is a difference between solitude and isolation. The wisdom of solitude is not an invitation to total exile. It is not about closing doors forever, but about learning to measure, choosing relationships that nourish rather than drain, cultivating deep friendships instead of collecting disposable contacts, valuing rare moments of silence as portals to oneself. Withdrawal can be strategy, but conscious solitude is choice. It is like an inner garden. It requires care, a balance between shadow and light. If we overwater, we suffocate the roots. If we abandon it, the flowers wither. The wisdom of solitude lies in knowing when to retreat and when to open, when to be silent and when to speak. It is a rhythm, almost a dance, discovered only through living it. Perhaps, then, true freedom does not lie in stepping away from the world, but in refusing to be imprisoned by it. The intelligent mind that abandons social life does not need to live as a hermit. It can transform withdrawal into discipline, contemplation, creation. Many of history's greatest thinkers, from Pascal to Kierkegaard, from Kafka to Emily Dickinson, found in solitude not only pain but also beauty. And what we learn from them is that solitude is not the end. It is a means to see the world without veils, to find oneself without masks, to realize that even alone, we are never entirely solitary, because we carry within us the inheritance of all humanity. Every idea read, every song heard, every memory lived becomes silent company along our path. The human paradox then reveals itself once more. We need solitude to truly know ourselves, yet we also need some connection to fully exist. The challenge is to avoid either extreme. The wise do not reject the world, but neither do they allow themselves to be drowned by it. They find a teacher in silence and a mirror in human contact. And perhaps this is what Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and so many others tried to show us, that the solitude of the intelligent is not a curse, but a destiny to be embraced with lucidity. It is not about fleeing social life out of disdain, but about choosing depth over distraction. The cost is high, yes, but the value is priceless. In the end, the question is not whether we should escape society, but how we can live in solitude without being destroyed by it. And the answer may lie in a simple yet powerful phrase: do not fear being with yourself. For when we learn to inhabit this inner space, solitude ceases to be an enemy. It becomes a companion, a teacher, a guide. And now, perhaps a silent question remains for you, the viewer: how far can you endure your own company? What do you discover when the noise of the world falls away? The answer, whatever it may be, is the beginning of wisdom. Because, in the end, it is not about running from the world. It is about discovering who you are when the world steps back. If you question the world as I do, join me. This channel is for those who refuse easy answers. Subscribe and wait for the next video.